Hi, my name is Erwin Schultz. I work at Benoit Coté. I've been working here for the last 14 months. I work primarily in chemical inventions, whether they be pharmaceutical or nanomaterials, for example. Disclosure requirement basically means that anybody who files a patent application has to have in the application sufficient information so that a person that actually reads the application is in a position to actually practice the invention, put it to its use as intended by the inventor himself. That's a very good question, actually, because especially in chemical cases, you often have the university setting, you have the smaller company settings versus the big pharma companies. Big pharma companies generally have, as we all know, a significant number of researchers doing the research, producing compounds, which is often not the case in, for example, a university setting where you have small research groups having 4 to 5 people in the lab producing new compounds. So in these smaller settings, obviously, since you have a limited number of researchers actually doing the research, the number of compounds that will actually find itself into the application will be significantly less than, for example, a big pharma company that can actually, as support for the application, produce thousands of compounds and have those in the application as well. So there's a difference there. Small companies have a harder difficulty to meet this requirement for proper disclosure due to limited resources. Therefore, they often have a limited number of experimental data that actually goes in the application. Sound prediction is basically something that smaller companies with limited resources and hence a more reduced disclosure can rely on to actually make a case for the utility of all the compounds in the application and seek a broader claim scope. Sound prediction basically requires that you have a proper disclosure in the application. By proper disclosure, what's meant by that is basically have a few examples in the application. For example, in the case of chemical compounds, where you actually show how these compounds are actually made and how these compounds, if you claim a biological activity, how these compounds are, describe the activity of the compounds themselves. Then there must be a sound line of reasoning in the application as well. By sound line of reasoning, it means that in your disclosure, you describe a few compounds, and then based maybe on similar structures, you can extrapolate by saying that by tweaking the compounds or the structures a little bit, there is a structure-activity relationship which leads you to a sound prediction that compounds of similar structure will have similar activity. And finally, proper disclosure in the application means that your reasoning must be properly described in the application. That then allows you to predict that a larger claim scope is warranted based on only a few examples. This is often more difficult, again, for smaller settings like universities with limited number of compounds. These components generally, when the application gets examined, these smaller entities will typically rely on sound prediction to justify a broader claim scope. Again, big pharma companies, they can incorporate a significantly larger amount of data, and they have to often rely less on this sound prediction requirement. Yeah, there is actually, because in patent law, there is a bit of a downside to the sound prediction requirement. That is, if you make the argument that in your claim scope, all these compounds exhibit a given activity, and it turns out that by going so broadly that you incorporate embodiments that do not work, for example, do not exhibit a given biological activity, that could lead to your patent becoming invalid. So you have to be very careful as to what you predict, and basically prediction based reasonably on the support that's provided. New use applications are patentable. For example, in, again, chemical cases, you have compound X, which is used to treat, for example, headaches. Then subsequently it is discovered that within the generic structure, you have a series of compounds that are now also, for example, good to treat heart disease. Heart disease would be the new use. In these new use applications, however, there should be care to be taken that there is actually sufficient amount of support to actually claim the new use. In For example, the original application where you claimed compound X to treat, for example, headaches, you had a disclosure of the compounds themselves, you had a disclosure of how the compounds are made, so these all fit into the original application. However, in a new use application, you're claiming basically known compounds, but for a different use. And in Canada, there is case law to the extent that you have to prove in those new use applications that these compounds actually exhibit a given utility. So for new use applications, it's important that the disclosure actually shows some support for the new utility of these compounds.